Alright, we've already started with the helmet stage, and for that stage I've generated some basic structures. You have already got the knowledge of how to generate them, but just in case, you'll have these subtools available for you to be able to use them. For this step, I'll use these pieces in Dynamesh, which will let me deform the piece with no problem. Let's start then with some masks in order to generate the basic shapes, or well, the basic volumes we'll need. Basically, on this stage, we'll use masks, we'll use different brushes, move type, we'll use the transpose and some other brushes in order to add some kind of more generic shapes. Let's fill this bit. The idea is that this doesn't take us too long. It has to be a quick job for generating just basic shapes. In this case, the corners or the edges, we can make them by using them standard. Also, what we do in this stage is that through other subtools, we make pieces from the same object. For instance, from this square, I'll generate an extra piece. Over here, for instance, I've already deleted the inner edges, so it becomes easier to adjust the piece. And little by little, it's easier to apply the shape until we get something like this. As I say, these shapes here are quite generic, and it doesn't matter in this case that the geometry gets deformed. The idea is, for instance over here, we'll have to fix it, but in this case it doesn't matter. Let's combine these two pieces simply using merge down. And we can regenerate the geometry using Dynamesh. Now it's simply about fixing it. For instance, over here on these intersections, it's useful to generate a volume that in order to avoid the internal and external faces getting too close, otherwise that would cause issues. That's kind of common using Dynamesh when we have a really thin geometry. So it's good to start adding volume, and when we get these imperfections, simply by using H polish, we fix them. Let's adjust this a bit using Move for adjusting certain shapes. And by using them standard, we'll refine the borders. Obviously, we have to add an edge to the internal areas. We don't want it to look too smooth or melted somehow. We want the helmet to look rigid, and a smoothing like that won't work. Once we've finished the basic shape, with a brush called Topology, we'll generate some lines. In order to tell Zero Measure what's the flow we need the geometry to follow. These lines are quite useful, and now, just by applying zero measure, then the geometry gets a flow kind of more defined. And simply, after adding some subdivisions, we start polishing using them standard. We'll fix these edges. A little over here, a bit here. All these edges, we have to polish them using them standard. Over here, this border, this kind of thin, we have to polish it, of course. It was the one that was damaged the most. And now, simply, we start removing imperfections all around the surface. And we do that simply by using edge polish. This polishing stage is probably the one that takes more time for me, because we have to remove all those odd imperfections that show up. Polish this here. And adjust this a bit using move. When we work with the brush move, it's convenient sometimes to reduce the subdivisions up to the lowest in order to get a lot less polygons, so it would be easier to adjust certain shapes. But in this case, since we need a certain amount of polygons for being able to see the original shape of the piece, we'd have to start trying out with the subdivisions. Again, we don't have to polish the inner borders, but in this case, we'll try to make them as perfect as possible. And flatten it as well. We have to polish this edge over here, although we are not getting this right, but we can fix it simply by using move. The idea is to get a similar thickness. We should have an even thickness all along this arc. Let's mark this so it's easier and simply adjust it. Let's also polish it up here in order to make sure the thickness is similar. Alright, over here looks good, so let's start adjusting this portion back here, where it is completely deformed. And that way, we fix those imperfections we get from the Dynamesh. Let's apply some more move over here. Fix this kind of fin. This brush I'm using here, Pinch, is really useful for fixing some imperfections on the borders. What it does is to contract the polygons, or it compresses them somehow. And that also fixes the curves. We are now getting the borders sharper. Over here, around here. That way, we go all around applying pinch on these borders in order to start making them more exact. On both the internal and the external. Alright. The only bad aspect about pinch is that it tends to compress too much the polygons and it breaks the topology. But lucky us, there is a tool for fixing that. We can find it over here in the deformation panel called Relax. We have to use low values, 2 or 3 maximum, in order to avoid ZBrush crashing. And what it does is basically to keep the shape of the piece, and it relaxes the polygons. Alright, with that, we've finished this video. This is the most basic technique for generating hard surface type pieces, but it lets us get good results pretty quickly. Let's take a break and we'll continue on the next session.